And I'm going to turn it over to our speaker tonight, Ciaran Doherty. He has a bachelor's and a master's from NAU. And his emphasis for his master's degree was on forestry and rangeland. In tonight's talk, I'll switch over to his slides. Is Arizona from wilderness to development. Ciaran, all yours.
Hi guys, thank you for coming again. I'm here on. And this is Arizona history, wilderness to metropolis. So the purpose of this presentation is just to showcase the connection between Arizona's environment and its industry, which later led to its development into the metropolitan state it is today. I do want to get it out of the way. This isn't a history of Arizona from its territorial designation in 1863 or to its statehood in 1912, but the area that eventually became Arizona all the way back to the last ice age. So I want to start off with an overview of Arizona's environment. It's changed so much in the last 200 years. I just want to remind you guys, Arizona has 5 major rivers: the Colorado, Little Colorado, Verde, Salt, the largest, and the Gila, and countless other sizable streams like the Santa Cruz and San Pedro, the Black and the White, the Blue and the Green rivers, all feed into and eventually the Colorado River. Arizona has roughly 200 mountain ranges, so it's not all desert like some people think. We live at the San Francisco Peaks. We got the White Mountains to the east, Cerbats to the west, the Bradshaws you see going down 17, the Four Peaks, Chiricahuas, the Sierra Estrellas. I'm sure you can name many more. The aptly named Tucson and Phoenix Mountains. Arizona's lowest point is 70 feet above sea level, right about there. Its highest point is about 10 miles that way. It's Humphreys Peak. The majority of Arizona is in the Basin and Range province, which is a physiographic feature of the western U.S., consisting of expansive lowland valleys separated by abrupt mountainous highlands, usually in a north to south formation, which you can kind of see down here. For the last 90 million years, Arizona has been the site of mountain building and subsequent erosion. In the same process that built the Rockies, the laramide orogeny thrust material deep from within Earth's crust into the mountains that I just described. The San Francisco Peaks, relatively young at only about 3 million years old. The Catalinas down near Tucson, roughly 15 million. The Chiricahuas are at 35 million. And the Bradshaws along the western side of 17 are 66 million years old. Arizona's diverse and varied landscape contains 6 different life zones. One of the few states that does, all the way from the lower Sonoran, below 2,000 feet in elevation, to alpine tundra, the top Humphreys Peak. And we boast rivers from lowland mesquite, along with Marion, to pinyon, juniper, chaparral, all the way to ponderosa pine and conifer firs. All right, there's our environmental overview.
Can I ask a question or should I wait till you?
You can ask it now.
How do you know how old these mountain ranges are? How do you know?
How do I know how old these mountain ranges are? Geologists have studied the rocks. That's how I know. Mining has helped a lot with that because we can get more rocks from completely. But I'll leave that up to the geologists. This is how the rest of the presentation is going to go. I'm going to give you guys a brief history of each of these 5 industries in each of these 3 periods. And then we're going to answer those questions. And those are really our thoughts that all around the presentation. All right. I want to start with trapping for a few reasons. It's a lesser known industry in Arizona. A lot of trapping's focus gets eastern US where a lot of the water is. But trapping and hunting are Arizona's first and oldest industry. Since the last ice age, indigenous Arizonans have made use of furs and hides from all sorts of Arizona's animals. In the highlands, you have the elk and the deer, even the antelope. And then you can get lower and lower to the coyotes, beavers, and rabbits. Saying that though, in this period, there wasn't a true fur trade as you think about it. The abundance and availability prevented furs commodification. They were most often used as tokens of tribute and gifts rather than a bartering and exchange trade. In the 16th century, when the Spanish entered in Coronado's first expedition in the 1540s, they established the true fur trade, where Spanish trappers and traders would barter with indigenous Arizonans for furs and hides of all the sort in exchange for iron, cloth, other Spanish materials. Furs and hides procured in Arizona, especially coarse furs, antelope, deer, and elk, would be traded with the Spanish and travel all the way back to Mexico City or even Spain. After Mexican independence in 1821, Mexico's failure to utilize its northern resources lost traction in Arizona area and led to the illegal American entry of American traders and trappers. Beginning in the 1820s, trappers entered Arizona looking particularly for otter, beaver, and muskrat furs for waterproof, desired eastern markets. Trappers came along, the Gila, the Salt, and even the Verde, such as Bill Williams, which is the city of Williams is named for, and the mountain over there. Anton LaRue, Jebediah Smith, Kit Carson, some of the most famous fur trappers trapped in Arizona. And there's our brief history. Now we'll get into this. How did Arizona's environment facilitate the trapping industry? Because of those 6 different life zones, you get a replete and variety of furs and hides to choose from. You get elk and deer up in the Colorado Plateau, coyotes and bobcats as you move down to the desert, and beavers, muskrat, and otters along Arizona's many riparian regions. How did the trapping industry impact Arizona's environment? Well, it was not only the first unnatural disruption to the natural order of things. Certain hides and furs were valued more. Predators actually took a lot of the brunt of that. But the trapping of beavers, otters, and muskrats in the American period severely disrupted Arizona's waterways. You get increased erosion and flooding while decreasing the water retention and wetland habitat. Here's an example of an arroyo cut, because there's not many beavers to hold the water in its natural water. And how did the trapping industry contribute to the development of Arizona? This is probably why I included trapping to begin with, because fur trappers in both the Hispanic and American periods became the first to familiarize themselves with Arizona's resources, terrain, and indigenous populations. And later, when the American expeditions were coming through this area, they used fur trappers such as Anton LaRue, who we have streets named for, and Springs. He guided the Sitgreaves and Whipple expedition through the Flagstaff area in the 1850s with his knowledge of the terrain, the populations, and its resources, being in the water island we are. All right. Now let's talk about mining. So indigenous Arizonans have mined for, again, thousands of years. And they mined a variety of minerals from clay, coal, and salt to turquoise, copper, quartz, even guano. You have the famous Hopi salt mine in the Grand Canyon. Black Mesa, where still one of the largest coal operations in the US happens. Indigenous populations mine that for the same material. Copper in the Black Hills near Jerome, and turquoise in the Cerbat, Western Mountains in the US or Arizona. Their mining isn't how you would think about it today, where people digging into mountains. It was mostly placer mining, which is exposed veins or in waterways where it would already be washed through. There's two reasons for that. Without iron metallurgy, digging through the mountains a lot tougher than it is with iron. And also there's some culturality differences between the hard work of mining versus procuring food and sustenance. Hunting and gathering was seen as more beneficial than mining extravagant materials. On Spanish arrival, as I said, in the 1540s, and especially in the 1580s to like 1670s, they begin placer and hard rock mining, which is what you think about digging into the ground. And they established several mines around Tubac, Quarry, Ajo, even as far north as the Sierra Estrellas, just south of Phoenix. There's still a mine you can check out in them. But the Spanish weren't miners. Contrary to popular belief, Spanish mining in South America was built on a slave system, which didn't exist in Arizona. So though they wanted gold, they couldn't mine it without indigenous slaves. After Mexican independence, a lot of these mines fell into disrepair. You had a few, especially in Ajo, that continued by lone prospectors, but nothing like it was. American mining began in 1863 with the discovery of gold near Prescott, Arizona. That ensues Arizona's gold rush, followed by its silver rush, and then its copper rush, the largest of which. And this is, you got placer, hard rock, and open pit mining. There's an open pit that's down in Bisbee, where instead of going inside the mountain, you just take the mountain out. And Arizona became essentially an extractive colony. You had Bisbee's copper, Tombstone silver, Wickenburg's gold, Black Mesa's coal, the Grand Canyon's uranium, and the town of Batshit, Arizona, which mined Batshit. So how did Arizona's environment facilitate the mining industry? Well, the million years of mountains building I told you about thrust minerals from deep within the earth towards the surface. The millions of more years of erosion exposed the veins, made them accessible to humans. How did the mining industry impact in Arizona's environment? Well, you have the obvious disruption of soils just from the mining itself, but more so it's the processing of the unrefined ore is much more impactful on the environment. Mills and smelters, like this one, and these two. Mills and smelters not only necessitate large amounts of water and the redirection of water, but they release aerosolized heavy metals and sulfur dioxide into the air. This is called a slag pile, which is basically the remnants of the ore containing none of the valuable parts. And it would just sit here and be washed away into rivers and streams by rain eventually. There are still several slag piles in Arizona. You can go down to Clarkdale and grab some slag. Hopefully not. The Verde Valley was a lot greener before Clarkdale Smelter nuked it, essentially. How did the mining industry contribute to Arizona's development? Well, the mining was the initial attraction to Arizona. Prospectors flocked to the newly discovered lodes. Settlements sprang up to house them, and they eventually grew into town. Mining is also responsible for creating the other industries I'm going to talk about, the lumbering, ranching, and agricultural industries to sustain those mines and mining towns.
Excuse me, what is the second picture?
The second picture is a flood of acid mine drainage. So once the mine's closed, water in the mountains seeps into those exposed heavy metals And then sometimes you get disasters like this that flows them out. The Gold King spill in Colorado a few years ago. You guys remember Garrett's River of bright orange, just like that. Pretty gnarly. Kills a lot of fish. Now let's move on to ranching. So domestic livestock ranching did not exist in Arizona prior to the Spanish. I do want to ask you guys a question. If you would think that indigenous wildlife stewardship counts as a form of ranching, that's just something to ponder on while I talk. But in the second half of the 15th century, indigenous Arizonans adopted sheep herding from the Spanish. Those expeditions I was talking about, like the Coronado, Espejo, and eventually Juan Onate, brought sheep with them, Iberian Chura sheep, and then either by getting lost or abandoned, several communities adopted the sheep. The Navajo in particular took up sheep herding, using the sheep for wool rather than just meat as their Apache neighbors did. And the Chura sheep found really good success in the Southwest. That's why they were brought here. They were very tenacious species of sheep. So they found a lot of success and they accumulated in large numbers, even prior to the American settlement. So the Spanish introduced both sheep and cattle ranching to Arizona. The first ranch in Arizona was established in 1539 near the Babacanary River in southern Arizona. Over a century later, Francisco Kino, who was pretty famous for bringing his first large herds of cattle into Arizona, went all around southern Arizona into Tucson, Babacanary, to McCaffrey, to back. And initially, ranching focused around the missions and the presidios. But by the 1700s, land grants began dictating larger ranching claims. And by 1800, still in the Spanish period, tens of thousands of sheep and cattle raised in southern Arizona. During the Mexican period, attacks by indigenous Arizonans, such as the Comanche and Apache, devastated any remaining Arizona ranches. But that wasn't for long because, then you get the American period. Initially, in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, Arizona is just treated as a way station on the way to California. And sheep and cattle ate their way across Arizona. But eventually, especially after a drought in California, knocked a lot of the grass back, ranchers came back across and settled in Arizona. The Beale Wagon Road that cuts through Flagstaff was one of these drive-through areas. Millions of cattle and sheep came through this area before Flagstaff was even settled, and they came back. American Arizona ranchers fed both mining and military establishments. And once the railroads arrived in the 1880s, cattle overcame sheep as the primary livestock in Arizona. Cattle were bigger to eat and better to graze, and with the advent of railroads, move them just as easy as sheep. You also had the range wars in the 1880s that consisted of sheep herders and cattle ranchers going at it violently because of the devastation that sheep reap on grasslands compared to cows. I like to say that sheep are like a lawnmower, while cattle are like several weed whackers. So they go at it violently, especially about an hour east of here. You have the Pleasant Valley War. About 20 people died over 20 years. Yeah. So how did Arizona's environment facilitate the ranching industry? Well, that basin and range geography I told you about earlier produced these lush lowland valleys where all the water accumulated, high water table, and then grassy highlands enable year-round grazing. How did Arizona's ranching industry impact the environment? Well, like I said, with sheep and cattle, livestock devastated Arizona's natural grasslands through their stomachs. but more so, their hooves degraded soils, increased erosion, and while they were eaten, they consumed and trampled seedlings, rendering natural reproduction nearly impossible. So, yeah. How did the ranching industry contribute to Arizona's development? Ranching not only supported the early settlements like the military camps and the mines, but it became an economic backbone and export of Arizona. Cattle became one of the 5 C's. If sheep was spelled with a C, it would definitely be one too. So lumbering. Again, for thousands of years, indigenous Arizonans have used lumber for a variety of purposes. Shelter, fuel, weapons, crafts, medicines. But for the most part, like mining, indigenous use of lumber was restricted to softwoods. Without the iron metallurgy, felling a gigantic ponderosa pine was a very tough task. That's not to say it wasn't done, especially east of here in New Mexico, Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. But those are large settlements that had the manpower to cut down those trees. For the most part, they're using in Arizona, they're using mesquite along rivers and pinyons for their wood use. And you can see in this picture, their wood is used for braces and buildings and such. The Spanish similarly used mesquite, especially for fires. Mesquite was a good burning wood. But their introduction of iron saws made it easier to cut down such hardwood trees, especially with the forests in the Santa Rita and Santa Catalina mountains near Tucson. The Spanish used lumber, that large lumber, for braces in their churches and presidios. And this is a picture of the mission of Poralai. It was built in 1680 something, about 65 miles east of here. Spanish, with their indigenous friends, came over here, chopped down wood from the Flagstaff area, carried it on the back of mules back 65 miles to the open mesas. During the Mexican period, small scale lumber use was made for fence posts and such like that. But again, there wasn't much going on in Arizona in the 1820s to 1840. And then you have the Americans who used lumber to the first extent, and in some cases, a disastrous extent. Initially, Americans used lumber for mining. You can see all the wood being used in these mines. Mesquite was used to fuel furnaces to process the ore from the smelters that I showed you earlier. While ponderosas were used to brace the mines from within. By the 1870s, the forests on top of the Catalinas and Santa Ritas were already exhausted. And the lumber industry started moving north into the Brashaws and the Prescott area, which by the 1890s were exhausted. And then eventually into the Flagstaff area, in which we live in the largest ponderosa pine forest. And then you had the advent of the railroads in the 1880s, and they used a tremendous amount of wood. Traditional railroad ties are about a foot apart, made of a 6 to 8 foot chunk of lumber. The railroad across northern Arizona was built purely with trees from this area. The railroad across southern Arizona is some California redwood. So how did Arizona's environment facilitate the lumber industry? Well, the life zones that I talked about earlier gave you a variety of wood to choose from riparian mesquite along the rivers to easily accessible Indian chaparral forests all the way to the highland ponderosa pine. How did the lumber industry impact Arizona's environment? Well, not only were the forests devastated, but the cutting of forests again increases erosion and decreases soil retention. The effects of Arizona's lumber industry are still being felt today in the devastating wildfires we have, because the forest was allowed to repopulate itself after such decimation. It's overgrown to an unhealthy extent. And how did the lumber industry contribute to Arizona's development? Well, it facilitated continued mining operations and enabled the continued growth and settlement of towns and cities. American cities are made of wood, whereas Spanish cities were mostly adobe. And it allowed for the expansion of the railroad and stimulated economic growth. A large chunk of our trees from Flagstaff went to California for citrus boxes. Just like that. I'm moving very quickly, so take a moment to appreciate it. So Arizona's paramount industry, the farming industry. Indigenous Arizonans began farming over 4,000 years ago. There's remnants around Tucson of such farming. The introduction of corn around 2000 BC marked the start of the early agricultural period, and subsequently the Three Sisters style of planting transitioned a lot of indigenous Arizonans from nomadic to sedentary lifestyles. Corn, squash, and beans come together. The Hohokam down in the Salt River Valley established the largest irrigation network in North America within the first millennium. Their descendants, the Pima and the O'odham, carried on this tradition after the Hohokam fizzled out in the 1300s. The Pima continued the tradition along the Gila, even further along the Santa Cruz. The Humans and Mojaves irrigated off the Colorado River near Yuma and in City. And the Hopis taught their sacred mesas employed a dry farming technique where they took advantage of the yearly precipitation cycle, planting in the fall right before a monsoon to give the seeds time to germinate over winter, and then spring showers would eventually allow them to grow. It established agriculture in a much drier climate away from flowing rivers. The Spanish introduced European crops to Arizona. So while there wasn't too many large Spanish farms like there were ranches, 2 of the 5 C's, citrus and cotton, were introduced by the Spanish, as well as wheat and barley. And wheat was a winter crop and enabled year-round harvests, which were very heavily adopted by remaining indigenous populations. Spanish farms were established in southern Arizona, near to McCackery in the San Xavier del Mar, the mission I showed you earlier. They implemented European farming techniques complemented by indigenous irrigation, which created Arizona's true agricultural industry. In the Mexican period, indigenous raids on those farms prevented most farm operations from continuing, but it didn't stop the rise of citrus and cotton as Arizona's principal crops. Americans immediately recognized Arizona's farming tradition, and in the 1860s, they refurbished ancient Hohokam canals along the Salt River, creating a basis for the settlement in the Phoenix area. Phoenix is named after the Greek mythological figure, being the revitalization of the agriculture. Within a few decades, though, agriculture outgrew Arizona's natural capabilities, and reclamation projects began to control water resources year-round. The Salt River project started in 1903 to dam the Salt River. Roosevelt Dam was completed in 1911. Arizona's American agriculture exploded during the World Wars period, and especially after the Second World War. Both the Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam were built with Arizona's agriculture in mind. And in the 1970s, one of the largest irrigation projects in history, the Central Arizona Project, created a canal stemming from Lake Havasu, 334 miles all the way to Tucson. That's the picture on the title slide. It's pretty crazy. You can see it while you drive down most of the way. So how did Arizona's environment facilitate the industry? I always say that if I wrote a book on Arizona agriculture, it would be called Sunshine and Floodplains. You can describe a big chunk of Arizona's area of that. Of course, we have mild winters and abundant sunshine, which created an ideal agricultural hub. And how did the farming industry impact Arizona's environment? Farming has completely reformed Arizona's water systems. Those 5 rivers I talked about earlier, the Gila, the Salt, are mostly dry most of the year. Back in the day, they flowed year round. Until about 100 years ago, you could take a boat all the way from the Colorado to the New Mexico. Surface water flows have been dammed or redirected, and the use of groundwater and wells have lowered the water table to a level unsustainable in culminating rivers. And how did the farming industry contribute to the development of Arizona? Well, more so than any other reason, farming is the reason for Arizona's development from wilderness to metropolis. It not only sustained the physical growth of Arizona, but it also the economic growth of the metropolis is today. Thank you, guys. Those are the industries I picked because they're historical, but there are a lot of different industries springing up now because of the loss of farming and mining and everything else. One in particular, I think, is data collection and the use of water to cool the supercomputers. They're springing up all over Phoenix and Tucson these days. So I think there's still a lot of room to continue research. Thank you for coming. Sorry it was quick.
There is another industry that's starting to boom, and that's the wine industry in the Verde Valley. Is that sustainable? Is there enough water? Or it used to be 3, now there's 23 wineries.
If there's enough water, that's a question for the federal government, but probably not. I know what you're talking about because yeah, those wine industries, that takes a lot of water. We already don't have enough water. Well, most of the water, especially going in there, is going to probably be reclaimed to feed those crops. The biggest water issue we have right now is just suburbia. All the water that doesn't get reclaimed from washing products. So that's a good point, though. I like that. Data. Any other questions?
Anything about this project from Havasu towards was it Tucson?
Tucson.
Yeah. You see when you go by road, you can look at it. Is that if you just drive to Phoenix, can you see that river?
So if you drive to Phoenix, right before you enter like Phoenix proper, you see a canal cutting across. You can follow that. It goes along the eastern part of Phoenix, but you can follow that. And then if you take the road to Tucson, it's right there. It's pretty. There's a map of it. Oops, I can do that right here. It goes all the way to the western edge of Tucson, and then this title page. That's an overhead picture. It's pretty insane.
So that's bike ride too, I mean.
Yeah, there are some parts where they have trails alongside.
Where about is that?
I think this is just southeast of Phoenix. And it started in the 70s, built till the 90s. It goes up 3,000 feet in elevation, so it pumps and stuff.
Is that part of why it's shaped the way it is, so that it uses the elevation decline, but
No, it actually has to use like electrical pumps to keep the water moving. Because there was just no way of getting around the crop. There's a
some it's
museum.
underground,
Huh?
some of it's under the ground, or is it all on the surface?
Few portions. I think a couple times it goes into a tunnel, but for the most part, you can see the whole thing. There's a museum opening up, I think in Glendale, Central Arizona. I think. Which one is it?
Was that how Phoenix gets its water?
Yep. Yeah, we get 4.3 million acre feet of water a year. on that thing.
What inspired you to start researching this topic?
Growing up in Arizona, I was never interested in Arizona history. I was interested in European history, like you. But then in my master's thesis, I did a paper on how Flagstaff's forest has changed in the last 150 years, which led to my intrigue in what else has changed. And especially with the soil and the erosion stuff, Arizona's environment has changed a lot just in the last 200 years. It was almost a completely different place before all this happened. Any other questions? Thank you guys.
Thanks, Ciaran.
Oh, wait, it was from the books. Sorry. There's some book recommendations, some that I really like during my research. This one's about Flagstaff. I think we should get that. There's the book on Hatchet.
Where is that?
It's about 40 miles north of King. It's right on the edge of the Grand Canyon. It's one of the largest guano mines in the world. Easy. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.